I begin my reflection, this is the last Sunday. The choir are going to take a well-earned summer break starting next week. So I just wanted to thank them for their work. Wish me on. Thank them for their work this summer, over the seasons. Thank you. You hold up our ministry so well. Of course, if you're here on Sundays, you're more than happy to sing. This passage from Samuel always makes me giggle when it comes up in the lectionary. Partly because it has some fun memories for me from my time at theological school when I was doing my master's. We used to have, at Vancouver School of Theology, we used to have a thing called the intensive week. Diane's going to never remember. Everyone's going to remember that. All the VST grads are going cringe. And one of the intensive weeks that we had was with Jim Lindenberger, who was the Old Testament professor at VST. We're all having flashbacks right now to Jim's class. Jim Lindenberger was running one of the intensives that year, and the passage he'd chosen and the activity we were to do was based on this piece of scripture. And so for a week, so you have to imagine that you're in Vancouver School of Theology. It was still at that point the castle on UBC property. And at the bottom, as you walk in the main doors, there is what they used to call the rotunda. And there were couches and stuff that we all used to kind of hang out on. And we moved all the couches and we moved all the furniture. And all that was left was the carpet in the middle. And we had, for a week, the argument that was named in this piece of scripture. Somebody was appointed to be Samuel, and someone was appointed to be the head of the Israelites, and then everybody else had to choose sides. And you had to choose whether you were going to be a supporter of Samuel and demand that the community stay with God and have God as their ruler, or you could join the side that was going to make the king and demand a king be put in place. And so every day for a week, we argued out this text. Some of us, not saying who in the room it was, but some of us chose to be the Peasant Revolutionary Party. I don't know who that was. Can't imagine who that girl was, who that woman was, but we chose to be some of us chose to be the Peasant Revolutionary Army and demanded to know exactly what we were getting out of this, because as far as we could see, only the priests and the courtiers were the only people benefiting out of the present systems. And we were demanding a revolution. But I won't say who led that, but you can all guess. You have no idea who that was. I won't tell you his name. So this was quite fun, as you can imagine, right? It was most fun for the principal of VST because their office was right by the rotunda. And for a week, all they could hear was us all arguing and fighting and running around the building, screaming and yelling about this. This was not the worst thing we had ever done in that space. That's for a whole different other story. But this is what we did for a week. We argued the scripture. So I love this piece of scripture because every time I see it, I can see my classmates and my friends and myself gathered in this space arguing the politics and the economics and the social and cultural implications of what this text talks about. Samuel is now the old man who was the little boy who had been anointed by God to take over as the great prophet of Israel from Eli, who was his teacher. Remember, Samuel is the son of Hannah, who had said that if she ever got pregnant, she would dedicate her son to the life of God. And when Eli's sons had not followed in the way of his priesthood and had done terrible injustices to the people, God had called Samuel out as the next great prophet, the one who would mediate between God and the people of God and keep the people kind of in right relationship with God. Fast forward now into Samuel's years as an older man, and we seem to have the same problem. Samuel's sons are unable to follow in the line of the priesthood. They are unjust. They squander the privilege they've been given as the priests. And the people are looking at it and wondering who will take over when Samuel dies. That's really part of the subtext of this. An anxious people wondering who will take over when Samuel dies. For there seems to be no other leader in Israel at this moment ready to take his place. Well, we all know that when there is a vacuum in leadership, something will happen, because nature abhors a vacuum. And so some of the leaders come to Samuel and say, we would like a king because we would like to be like everybody else. All around them are kingly states. They are surrounded. Israel is a small nation surrounded by many mighty nations. Israel is fought over by these mighty nations because they are in the middle of the trade routes. And so despite the fact that under Samuel's leadership, they have been able to defeat the Philistines, their greatest enemies, the people feel that they want to have a change of system. They want a different political system. And so they demand a king. And Samuel, of course, goes to God and says, do you hear what they're saying? They're rejecting me. They don't want to carry on in this style. And God says to Samuel, it's not you they're rejecting. It's me. It's me they're rejecting. They're not rejecting you. But you need to tell these people, Samuel, you need to tell them that they will get what they asked for and more. For in rejecting me, they are rejecting me as all of Israel has rejected me time and again. And that means that they will suffer. And so Samuel goes back to the people and says to the people, you can have a king, but you need to know what that means. If you are going to change the political system that you live in, if you are not going to have God be the ruler of you, if you choose to put a king in place, if you reject God, your sons will be taken from you and your daughters will be taken from you, and they will be put in service to the court of the king, and all of the best of your livestock and your crops and everything that you have will go to feed that machine. And it will become so oppressive that it will feel like you are slaves. But despite the warnings, despite everything Samuel says to them, the people push for a king. And so we have Saul. And Saul becomes the first anointed king of Israel. And Israel's history changes in that moment. You see, really, the basic warning of this passage is, be careful what you pray for. You just might get it. If you look at the passage really carefully, it is not all of Israel who come. It is some of Israel who come. It is some of the leaders who come. And when there is a vacuum in leadership, often what happens is people who see an opportunity for power and influence and having things done just their way, step in to fill it. We've all seen it. You know the great boss that you had who was amazing and you really, really enjoyed them, and they made you feel empowered, and they brought out the best in everybody who you worked with. You remember that boss? We've all had that boss, right? That was the boss who inspired us. That was the boss who was like, when you started there as a junior in the department, you were just like, I just want to be like them. And you worked hard for them, and you did amazing things, and you created amazing things. But the thing that boss forgot to do, or the system forgot to do, was prepare somebody to take over from them when they left. And they leave. And a vacuum occurs. And suddenly the anxiety of the people starts to rise. And in the anxiety rising, people start to say, well, I think actually I have a better way of doing it. We should do it this way or that way. If you follow my rules rather than the old rules, we'll get on so much better. Or bullies fill space. Bullies are great at filling those kind of vacuums in leadership. You step in really well, and suddenly you realize that, people are not getting an opportunity to show off their gifts. And suddenly, instead of being empowered, you start to feel like you're being put in the corner. And you start to lose enthusiasm for the job you had. And you start looking up the help wanted ads. You put your resume on Indeed online or Monster.com. And you start to realize that things are not as they should be. And you start to realize that the things that you were really good at are suddenly you're not getting any credit for it anymore. And someone else is getting all the credit for all the stuff coming out of your department or your area of work, and that person did nothing on it. And the atmosphere changes, and people start to leave, and the system starts to break down. Some of us have been there. Or maybe a church board that behaves like that. Or a charity that you volunteer in. There's always instances in life where that happens. And it's hard on the people. And you start to feel like a slave instead of a participant. You start to feel resentful and no longer part of the community. And that's what happens here. And we see it at its worst in the political world. I told you a couple of weeks ago, I told you when I got back from, where was it? DC. Where was that? I would tell you about my trip to the Holocaust Museum. And that trip reminds me of this passage. Germany in the 1930s or in the 1920s and 30s after the First World War had a vacuum of leadership. As I say, nature hates vacuums. And there was a rise in the community of nationalism. Germany first. Make Germany great again. Don't record that. But there was a rise in nationalism. Germany first, kind of. And when you go to the Holocaust Museum in DC and you look, or you go to any of the Holocaust museums and you look, you will see the newspapers and the television, the newsreels of the time. And it very much is, make Germany great again. A rise of nationalism. And that led to one of the most horrific episodes in human history. One of the most horrific episodes in our history. Something we will all live with, hopefully, from generation to generation, to remind us that that is not the way God calls the world to be. When we do not prepare, when we question God's leadership, when we look to other places for comfort and leadership, when we turn to consumerism, when we turn to pornography, when we turn to drugs, when we turn to alcohol, really what we're doing is filling a void in our personal and community lives that should be being filled by God's holy presence. And when communities have these kind of voids, bullies enter into leadership. And when nations have it, we have the worst bullies of all. We have people who will disguise the best, or will disguise activities in their own best interest as being for the national good, or the province's good, or the city's good. It almost feels, and we don't have to look down south of the border for this, it almost feels that Samuel is writing to our political lives right now. That Samuel is writing to remind us that we must be careful what we wish for in a leader, for we just might get it. The people of Israel, or the leaders of Israel, when they came to Samuel, didn't ask for Samuel to raise up another prophet for them. They didn't want the prophetic line to continue, because as long as the prophetic line was there, as long as the priests were the ones who were helping them lead the nation and were being in relationship with God and making sure that the people were turned towards God and building that relationship at all times, as long as that was there, there was no room for them. There was no room for them to exert their power for their own good and their own well-being. They couldn't squander the great resources of the people as long as Samuel and the prophets kept the people focused on God. So instead of coming and asking for a prophet, which is what they should have done, they come and they ask for a king. For a king will give them power. A king will allow them to amass wealth. And a king will create a situation where the people will become enslaved once again. There are some who would claim that this is actually the very beginning of the journey of the people of Israel into their exile in Babylon. That this is a journey of hundreds of years that they are beginning, that will take them to Babylon, into exile and into their most broken place since they had been slaves in Egypt. The call of God in this piece, the call of God, is a call to the prophets to rise up and speak. From now on, the prophets will be constantly in opposite positions from the kings. There will be great prophets who will stand up and face kings down. And that's the role of the church right now. It is our time to stand up and face great kings down. To name the injustices of our world. To say that we are tired of being enslaved to systems that hold us in places of oppression. To speak for the voiceless. To march for those who cannot march. And to call the people back to God. Not as a personal salvation piece, but rather as a war cry against an oppressive way of existing that makes us often feel as if we are broken and dead inside. The church has a chance here to raise its voice up, to speak into those places where we look in our communities and our country and the world and say, God has warned us of these things. God has warned us that if we follow these ways, we will become enslaved instead of free people before God, living out our full humanity. Samuel passage is a warning. Be careful what you pray for. You just might get it.